Camera speeds.
Today is August 23rd, 2018. I'm Adrienne Falaise here with Walon Green for the Interviews in Oral History of Television and the Writers Guild Foundation, and we are in Santa Ynez, California.
Camera speeds.
Thank you so much for sitting down with us today, Walon.
Happy to be here.
So we'd like to start just by getting some background information. So first question is, what was your name at birth?
My name at birth, Walon Charles Green.
And when and where were you born?
I was born in Baltimore on December 15th, 1936.
And did you grow up in Baltimore too?
No, my mother's family was from Baltimore. I did spend time there at various times during my youth. But for the most part, I lived in Beverly Hills, California when I was young.
So what brought your family out there?
My mother and father were divorced when I was 6 months old. And she married a man who was a songwriter, James V. Monaco, who was a songwriter for Bing Crosby. And they moved to Beverly Hills because he had a contract at 20th Century Fox writing Crosby songs.
Wow. And then just for the record, what were your parents' names and what did they do?
My mother was a showgirl. Her name was Virginia Case. Elsie Esther Case was her original name. She changed it to Virginia when she went to Broadway at the age of 17. She was a Ziegfeld girl. And my father, his name was Walon Wilbur Green. He was from a Southern family. And his father owned a hotel on the Markwell, which was actually in a Marty Scorsese movie. He owned a hotel right off 42nd Street where the showgirls stayed, and my father was the night clerk.
Wow. So a little bit of showbiz in your family then.
Mm-hmm.
Did you grow up kind of around the industry at all in LA?
I did grow up in LA around the industry, but strangely enough, I never thought of myself going into it. I don't know why. I was a terrific movie buff, and we had like a group of kids. Jack Haley Jr. was someone I've known since the late Jack Haley Jr. Since at this time, since I was in grammar school. And we all used to take the red car and go to Hollywood and go to movies. And then I found foreign films actually when I was about 10 or 11 years old. And there were theaters then, there were art houses, So I was crazy about movies, but I never, for some strange reason, all through high school and even college, didn't think of going into the film business.
Did you do any writing when you were growing up?
Not only what I needed to do for for school. I read a lot. I think if anything, I gravitated more towards literature than in terms of what I thought maybe I would do, I don't know why I didn't think about films, because I was certainly, a major film buff without actually knowing it.
Was there a certain genre of book or movie that you enjoyed?
Well, I remember, we went to the movies in those days, we're talking about the 40s. We went to in 50s even. We went to the movies at least once a week, usually twice. And we saw, naturally, young male, I liked westerns, I liked action movies, I liked film noir a lot. My favorite movie as a kid was Treasure of the Sierra Madre. And I don't know, I probably saw it 11 times or something like that. But I also liked It's a Wonderful Life, which was a hard movie to see then because it had gotten a bad release and you had to sort of track it down. The Cocteau's film Beauty and the Beast was a film I remember being really impressed by. I liked the neorealist films. Shoeshine I saw, I think when I was 11 or 12, De Sica's film. And I thought, oh, there's something really special about these movies. And, it was in Italian. I don't know why I related to it so much, but I did. I somehow felt it was real, which I suppose being a neorealistic film, it should have been. Bicycle Thief, those films when I was really young, were very, impressed me greatly. and I think I started taking films a little more seriously. Then it sort of came into the interest I had in literature, which I've always felt was more serious than films.
So let's talk a little bit more about your parents too. What traits do you think you inherited from your parents?
Well, both my mother and father are pretty good raconteurs, in a completely different style. By the way, my mother and father were divorced when I was 6 months old, but they remarried when I was 17.
Oh, wow.
So I did spend a lot of time with them together. They were both good storytellers, and I heard that. Plus, they were around people that also were good storytellers. Like people who are raconteurs, will turn a dinner party into kind of an amazing evening, and, outdoing each other and so forth and so on. And I was exposed to that a lot. And so, without knowing that I knew a good story, I kind of knew a good story when I was a kid. And I kind of got into telling stories myself, without sort of mimicking my parents, but just it seemed like the thing to do. I was never particularly good at games. I don't know how glib I was or not, but I sort of thought if I could get three people sitting together, I probably could get them interested in hearing a story.
What about school? Did you enjoy school?
Sometimes I enjoyed it, sometimes I didn't. I was like an A and F student, like A's in things I liked, F's in like mathematics. I was terrible at math. And I was dyslexic, which nobody knew what that was then. My handwriting was bad, and I was always getting called out for it. But when I liked something, I liked literature, I liked reading. I read all of the classic comic books, and actually won a book prize at my school for knowledge of the classics, which they took away from me when they found out it came from the classic comics. But I was gravitated towards it without any sort of direction, without knowing why I liked it. My father was he was a great storyteller. He was a pretty good reader, but very selective. And he read Jane Austen, and he read Thackeray, and he was an Anglophile, so he gravitated towards that. My mother didn't really read. She liked to hear stories, and she remembered stories and, liked retelling them. My father's interest in film was not that much. My mother loved musicals.
Where did you go to college?
When I got out of the last year of high school, I did at a Bible college in North Carolina called Wingate College, which is now Wingate University, I think. And then I went from there to the University of Mexico. And I was, mainly because I wanted to get to Mexico to see tropical bird life and kind of go exploring in Mayan ruins and stuff like that. So I got down to Mexico, and then from Mexico, my parents moved to Spain, and I had the opportunity to go to Europe. And one of the subjects I had excelled in high school was German. I spoke pretty good German, and I had a wonderful teacher. And so I went to Europe thinking, well, they were in Europe, I'll go to school in Europe. I first thought of England. It was impossible to get in. But the German universities then were looking for students that were other than Middle Eastern, to kind of get some balance. So they would cut you a slack on Greek and Latin if you could pass the basic exam. So I brushed up my German for about 3 months, and I took the exam at Göttingen and got in. And I was there for a year and a half. And then I transferred to the University of Barcelona. And I was there for a year, maybe a year and a half, I forget. And then I was going to get drafted, so I came back to the United States.
Wow. So did you have a major? What were you studying?
I majored in Germany. I majored in German literature and European history. And then in Spain, I majored in Spanish literature and Spanish history.
Wow.
So, And I kind of got a smattering of a classical education, but because to have been a university student at that time, you had to know the classics. I didn't, but I was around, the kids I was with, everybody I was with did know them, you know. So I started reading the Greeks, you know, and I started looking at, you know, Roman history and Greek history and so forth, and kind of familiarizing myself as an autodidact, basically.
So this is the late 1950s?
Yeah, this is the late 1950s. Then to not get drafted, I did what George W. Bush did. I joined the Air National Guard and went through basic training. And because I knew Spanish, they wanted to send me to Panama or to Puerto Rico, you know, which was fine. I was in Puerto Rico for 2 weeks, and I was in Panama for, I can't remember, you know, a short time. And then when I got out of the service, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was like, you know, a wayward person who had a lot of thinking about things, but couldn't really do anything. And I got a job in Mexico with a company as a construction company, as kind of the equivalent of a line producer. I mean, we were building things all over Mexico, mainly irrigation facilities and things like that. And once the engineers had gone and outlined what the job would be, then I would go and hire the people and interview people for the jobs and so forth and so on. And I liked it. It was really good. I did that for a year and a half. A lot of the Wild Bunch came out of that, you know. But then I came back to the United States, and I really wanted to try and figure out how to get into the film business, because I thought the one thing that, even while I was in Mexico in really rural areas, I would go and find somehow there'd be Padre Panchali would be playing somewhere. There'd be a Sachet Rai film in you know, in Oaxaca, and and I would find it. And so then when I came back, I thought, oh, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to do this. And my wife, Celeste, who I've known since grammar school, was friendly then with Jack Haley Jr. And she said, well, Jack hasn't seen you since you were kids, and he and David Wolper have got a company. And, you know, maybe Jack would give you a job. And so I called Jack, or she called him, I can't remember, and he said, I went and met him, and he said, well, yeah, he said, here's how we do it. We pay you $150 for a 50-page research paper. And then we put these out to like 3 people, and then the people who do the best research paper get the job. So my first one was Teenage Idols, because they had a show called Hollywood and the Stars. It was a half-hour documentary series. And they wanted to do one on Teenage Idols. And so I went to the Academy and I researched it and so forth. I wrote the paper. And Jack said, well, there's one guy whose paper's actually better than yours. And his name was Bud Weiser, who became quite a writer, a comedy writer. I think he worked on a lot of good comedy shows and worked with Jim Brooks a lot. And so Bud got the job, but Jack said, but we'll give you another one to do. And and the other one was the Swashbucklers. And so I did another one on the Swashbucklers. Meanwhile, I was working just to survive. I was working, setting tile and just doing any kind of job. And the second one got me the job as a researcher on Hollywood and the Stars. That was my entree into the industry.
So were you made like a staff researcher at that point, or was
yes,
it still
there was a research office under a man named Bill Edgar, and Bill taught me an enormous amount about writing. because Bill was a great editor, and you wrote stuff, and he came and moved things around and told you to start with this and not that, and so forth and so on. He was very instrumental. And other people there helped me too. Tom Fuchs, another researcher. I think I was the person, my ideas weren't bad, but I had trouble, technically I was kind of, first of all, from having been in German so long, I was putting verbs at the end of the sentence, and I mean, my syntax was kind of wacky. And so I kind of had to relearn, just basic, not English, obviously it was the mother tongue, I spoke it perfectly, but just writing in something and writing, developing a form. I got a lot of help, and then I could actually sort of get the story, whatever was in my head, I could get it on the paper.
Were you writing narration for the documentaries too?
It's funny that I didn't write narration. I always thought that we had really good narration writers. Marshall Flaum, Mel Stewart did not write his narration. Jim Brooks, Bud. There were people who really were gifted narration writers. And I was always intimidated by it. I always thought, and I didn't know whose voice it was. I thought, who's saying this? I mean, is this God? Are we writing God? I mean, who's this character? And I had trouble doing it. And then finally, Alan Landsberg, I did a show called Reptiles and Amphibians for National Geographic. And he said, yeah, you're going to write this show. And I said, oh, can't Bud write it or Jim or someone? He said, no, you're going to write it. You come in, you're going to spend 4 days in my office and you're going to write the show. And he basically made me write it, but told me how to write it. Then I could write it, but I still didn't think I always thought, oh, someone else could write this better. So even like Hellstrom Chronicle was written by David Seltzer. I didn't write it. Narration, I've written it since then, and now I don't have so much trouble writing it. But then I was intimidated by it.
Yeah. You mentioned you were dyslexic too. When were you officially diagnosed, or?
I was never officially diagnosed because at that time I don't think there was a diagnosis for dyslexia. It was just somebody was looking at my writing once and said, oh, why do you do this, why do you do a D like a B, or, why do you do that backwards? And I said, oh, I don't know, it's just, and they said, well, you're dyslexic. And then they said, write this for me. And I wrote it out, and they said, yeah, you're dyslexic. Didn't you know that? And I said, no.
So did the mentors there help you to find strategies for how best to write?
Well, no, because the typewriter saved me.
Oh.
I took a typing course in high school, which was, and I could type. As long as I was typing, I was okay. It was when I had to write longhand, that it was hard for me. Typing, I'm not a great typist, but I could type pretty good. And we typed everything. And in the beginning, before we had copiers, we typed on carbon with so to make copies, you had to put carbons in. And I think for Wolper, we were using maybe we had to do 3 copies. And that was hard. You had to roll it back and white it out and change it. It took forever to do it. I mean, it's funny now when I read stuff that I used to write, or that I know I wrote on a typewriter, and I'm amazed that I got through it. Because now, of course, it's so easy to do everything.
Talk about working with David Wolper himself. What was he like?
David, when I first started working there and did the geographics, David was an executive mainly in charge of sales, and Alan Landsberg and Mel Stewart were like my 2 bosses, that I worked for. And David liked the stuff I was doing. I mean, he praised the shows. And when Cousteau signed on, he signed on to do the Cousteau shows, David thought I was a good fit for him, and I was still a researcher then, and he put me together with Cousteau, and I was a natural history buff, so I hit it off with him instantly. And then his son, Philippe, came over, and Jacques wanted Philippe to become, involved in filmmaking. And so Philippe and I became really good friends, personal friends, and then we started going around filming stuff together. And there's another kind of trivial connection here, but Philippe Cousteau had married a girl who had been engaged to a friend of mine, but I didn't know that. And we were flying to Baja together when we first sort of met, and he took a plane and he flew. He was a pilot. I didn't know how to fly yet then. And we were flying down to Baja, and he said, "Oh, my wife is coming. I'm very nervous about her coming to LA." And I said, "Why is that?" He said, "Well," he said, "she was engaged to a race car driver in Los Angeles. And she's going to be there in Los Angeles on her own." And so he was, concerned Frenchman. And I said, "Engaged to a race car driver? There aren't that many. Who was it?" He said, "Bruce Kessler." I said, "Jan? You married Jan?" And he went, "Oh, you know her too?" Like that. And I said, "Yeah, of course I know her." I said, "I know Bruce. I've known Bruce since high school. We went to high school together." Oh, wow. So, but anyway, and I said, "Hey, Bruce, I know Bruce really well. Don't worry. He's an honorable guy, blah, blah, blah." And I knew Jan, too. I actually knew Jan better than he knew her in terms of time. And so then that put his mind at ease. And, but we were really close friends. His death was a real loss.
So let's talk a little more in depth about some of these projects.
Mm-hmm.
The Underseas World of Jacques Cousteau. Were you actually on Calypso?
Yeah, I was on Calypso for 3 weeks.
So I imagine you had to outfit the boat for shooting.
Well, you didn't really have to outfit. Remember that Louis Malle had made Silent World on Calypso. And Cousteau was very aware of film and the necessities of film, and wanted everything filmed. Mm-hmm. So there really wasn't much to do in terms of outfitting the boat for shooting. The cameramen were his cameramen, Renoir and Delroy, can't remember who else, and they did all the underwater stuff. I went to Calypso with John Alonzo, who was a cameraman I'd worked with here. And basically what we shot was the above water stuff to tie in with the underwater stuff. And everybody was very camera savvy, very film savvy on the boat. The boat was quite wonderful. You had to shoot in the morning because after lunch it was, forget about it. Lunch was great. It was a big sumptuous meal. And, the French are wonderful. I mean, you could sit there and argue for half an hour about whether Pepsi was better than Coke. And I really liked it. His wife, Simone Cousteau, really she ran the ship. Because Cousteau was off, dealing with the bigger part of the business most of the time, having to go to New York and talk to network executives and go here and go there. Plus all the people that were funding them. Geographic funded them, and the Grimaldi family, and Monaco funded them. But it was, and as a kid I'd read Silent World and thought, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful to be on Calypso one? And suddenly there I was.
So did you have much interaction with Jacques then?
Oh yeah, I flew around with him a couple times. When he came to town, I was sort of the guy that took him here and took him there and talked about what we were doing. And then he wanted me to sketch out. He would give me an area, like he'd say, "We're going to the Maldives. What do you think is interesting about the Maldives?" And I would do like a research paper, and then I would present it to him. He didn't want to read it, he wanted verbal presentation. And so, I spent hours with him, and sometimes we had funny, Jacques had funny opinions about like science. Like I remember I told him, you know, coral reef fish have what's called poster coloration. So each fish is advertising, this is what I am, this is the mood I'm in, and this is what I do, and that's how they signal each other. And so all that amazing coloring, you know, on coral reef fish is the result of selective evolution of this poster coloration, and it's tied very closely to their behavior. And Jacques said, "Oh, I don't like that. They're simply beautiful. Why do we want to explain that away?" You know. So, but he had a kind of a romantic view of the sea and that, and sometimes the science conflicted with it.
And I think Rod Serling narrated the series. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. And I didn't know him though. I never met him because I was either with Jacques or with Philippe, or doing research, you know, somewhere. Where else was I with Jacques? Well, we chartered a boat to go to Mexico and film the whales in Scammons Lagoon and in San Ignacio, Magdalena Bay. And Philippe and I had flown down there first and scouted it and found these places that we thought were good. We did the Gulf of California, and then took Jacques down in a small plane and showed him what we thought was interesting. You know, it was a good relationship.
It's amazing. And then you did several National Geographic specials. Yeah. So I think I have in the credits you wore a number of hats for those: cinematographer, producer, director. Talk a little bit about your roles on some of those.
Well, when Wolper made a deal with the National Geographic, most of the filmmakers at Wolper had come out of New York filmmaking. They come out of 20th Century, which was a terrific documentary series under a man named Isaac Kleinerman. And they were, you know, they were really good with historical subjects, clip shows, you know, and so forth, and made wonderful films, and were extremely talented. But none of them had any natural history experience. And I was, from a kid, I was always a nature buff. And so when they made the deal with National Geographic, I was working with Cousteau, and Wolper had just made the deal with Geographic, and he said, I want you to meet the people from Geographic because I think you talk their kind of language and so forth. And so I was researching on a show called Dr. Leakey and the Dawn of Man that Nick Noxon made. But the Geographic people came, and you know, kind of very quickly they thought, well, this is kind of the in-house natural history guy. And they wanted to do a show on birds. And I really wanted to do it, but they hired someone else. And I was working with Cousteau. You know, I was disappointed because I thought, oh, God, I'd love to do a bird show. But, and I was probably the only person at Wolper that would have wanted to do a bird show. So, but it didn't work out with the other person. And so they called me, and I can't remember how, I was spread thin. I was doing two things at the same time. I might have been finished, I can't remember what it was. But I said, well, I need to work with someone else. So there was a guy there, Jeff Myra, who was a writer. So basically, oh, I remember what it was. Actually, I had agreed to do an Amazon show for Geographic, and I had shot it, and I had typhoid fever. So I was recovering from typhoid fever, and the bird show fell apart. And they said, could you do the bird show? So I said, you know, I was editing in my house because I couldn't get out of, you know, up and around. It took me about 4 months to recover. And so they moved to the editing facility there. So then I started blocking out the show and looking at footage and so forth and so on. And I went and did the shoots. There weren't that many shoots because we found this man named Heinz Seelman who had more footage that I did another show with, 2 more shows with his material. And so I ended up getting to do the bird show, I guess is the short and the long of this story. And Jeff wrote the narration.
And a lot of this stuff was like really extreme close-ups of animal life and insect life, and time lapse of plant growth. So talk a little bit about what production was like on these.
Well, when we first started doing the shows, the tradition of Wolper was to find material that had already been shot, because that's what everybody came out of. And there wasn't a lot of new shooting done. Now, Mel Stewart probably did the most, because he did The Making of the President, and he did, and then The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich involved some interviews with, Nazis and so forth who were still around. And so people went out and did shoot that. But when the animal shows came along, there just wasn't enough existing footage that was good. And so it had to be color, because part of the reason Geographic came to TV and Cousteau was color TV. Suddenly there was color TV. Everybody wanted to see things in color. So as a consequence, and this was part of the reason it was a big boon for my career, because suddenly they said, we have to shoot. How do you shoot this stuff? Where is it? What can you get? What can you actually shoot? And so I had to think of natural history subjects that could be shootable and on a schedule. So most of those were not sort of the behavioral element, the planet Earth type parts of the show. Most of the stuff we shot was something that people could do as an experiment. I mean, to give you an example, in the bird show, the Manx's shearwater can find the island that it nests on no matter where you take it. You can take it anywhere in the world, it'll come back to that island, and no one knows exactly how. And it's kind of an amazing thing, because you can take them across the Atlantic, or you can take them to Venice, Italy, and they'll find their way out of the Mediterranean and back to the island. So that's a good experiment, because you go to the island, you mark the Manx's shearwater, you take the Manx's shearwater somewhere, you release him, and then he comes back. So that was a sequence that you could actually go out and shoot. So those were the things we looked for that we could actually film. But as we filmed those successfully, and as the shows got more demanding, we had to say, well, we're going to have to start shooting this natural history stuff ourselves, and shooting the animals themselves, and doing whatever they're doing that we need for the show. So it was, natural history shooting is probably 60% planning, 10% activity, and the rest is luck. And we would go and hope we'd get it. And it was very hard explaining to people in Hollywood that you didn't get something because the animal didn't show up or didn't do it. And that's what I meant, the luck factor was a big one. And you could just go and hit the wall and get nothing. Or you could go and get something remarkable and everybody thought you were amazing. But we did it, and we got better and better as time went on, at doing it. There were a handful of people in the world that were doing it, but very few. And Disney had done some films with a couple called the Malots, and they were no longer together and they were no longer filming. There were a few other people, but we couldn't get them. Some of them had quit, some of them, weren't around anymore or whatever. And so we just had to kind of, fly by the seat of our pants.
So you were kind of traveling the world with Wolper Productions, it sounds like.
Yeah, well, Geographic was wonderful in that respect. I mean, Geographic, you could just say, I think it might be a really interesting sequence if we go to Singapore and see the mating ritual of the mud skipper, and they would say, oh, well, just go check it out, pull a ticket and go look.
You were involved in a special that had to do with Nazis as well, weren't you? The Search.
That was the first thing. That was my breakout show. Mm-hmm.
So that was the March of Time, the Search for Vengeance.
Right.
Which took you to South America.
Yeah, I had worked on a low budget feature, shooting second unit stuff for it in South America and editing it for the film. And the editing room, I was in an editing room in Rio, and the man who either owned it or ran it was a man named Carl Eichhorn. And Eichhorn told me that Leni Riefenstahl had used the same editing facility and spent time there and was trying to get a film together in Rio. And this is, speaking German helped, you know, because this guy thought I was a guy you could talk to, right? Mm-hmm. And so he started telling me about it. He said, but you know, it's very uncomfortable here. You know, the Jews are after these people that have now changed their lives. They're now trying to live in innocence. You know, he's a completely unrepentant Nazi. But I listened to all of this. And then he told me, he said, you know, the best place to live is actually along the border of Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina, because there's German Mennonite settlements there, these agricultural settlements, and you can live there and nobody's going to bother you. And later on, I saw a photo of Eichmann on a boat, and I think, if I'm remembering correctly, it was taken on the boat when he went to South America, and this guy, Carl Eichhorn, was standing with him. So he was clearly connected. But it was of no, I mean, other than interest, you know, I mean, kind of interesting, but I had no particular use for it. Well, then I came back and I was working at Walper, and they had a film that called Search for Vengeance. It was part of the March of Time series. And at that time, the German government and Simon Wiesenthal and a guy named Tuvia Friedman had decided to go after these people. Fritz Bauer was the prosecutor general of Hamburg, and he decided to try them in Germany and arrest them if he could. And of course, Wiesenthal, you know, was keeping all these records, you know, where they were and who they were. And this guy in Tel Aviv named Tuvia Friedman was doing a similar kind of thing. And so they had shot interviews with them, and they shot interview with Fritz Bauer. But basically, the show had no ending. I mean, it ran for 30 minutes of who these Nazis were and where they had gone, but they were gone. They had vanished. They were nowhere. And so Walper had some wonderful things that he did at his company. No one would do it. If a show was in trouble, he would have a screening for the entire company. Everybody. I mean, it didn't matter if you were the guy on the loading dock, you know. And then he would say, you know, we got a disaster here. Who can fix this? Has anybody got any ideas? You like that. And basically, it was like a class where you raised your hand. And so I raised my hand and said, you know, I was in South America and I heard about these villages, these towns, these Mennonite agricultural communities that Nazis favored because they felt safe there. So he said, take 2 weeks and bring me some kind of research on it. And so I went to the UCLA library, and because I thought, I mean, the one thing I knew from having gone to school and, you know, college in Germany and, you know, knew something about Germans, the most interested people in the world in Nazis are the Jews, and secondly, probably the Germans, you know, themselves. And all their magazines always have some article about something in it. So I did this research and I found a bunch of articles in Spiegel about these towns, the Mennonite towns, because I thought somebody's been there, somebody's seen them, or, you know, and the Israelis are probably onto them, but where you would ever get that information from them, probably be pretty tough. But I thought the Germans will be blabbing about this. And so sure enough, there were a bunch of articles about the towns, and there was all kinds of articles about Nazis in this area, in this particular region of Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina. So I went to Walper and I said, what I think I could do, David, is I can't pass for a German, but I can pass for a German American. I mean, I can pass for somebody like from Pennsylvania whose parents were German, you know. And I could tell him I'm making a film for my Lutheran church or something, and take a camera and just go as an amateur and go down there and see what I can get. And he said, you know, go find Borman. And I said, well, I mean, I don't know. I can't guarantee anything, but I did have some pretty good leads, you know, because I had the names of the cops in Brazil who were after them. I had a place where 2 people were killed in Brazil that supposedly were Israeli agents, you know. I mean, I had some stories out of these German articles. So anyway, I took a Beaulieu and a Ewer tape recorder, you know, and I went down there and I went to the towns and started talking to people and so forth. Well, it turned out that Josef Mengele's brother, Alois, was the John Deere dealer for that area, John Deere tractor dealer. And so Mengele was showing up there all the time, you know, and Fritz Bauer wanted Mengele bad. He wanted to extradite him and try him in Germany. And so I got enough I can't remember. I mean, I got some interview. I got an interview with Mengele's best friend, this guy Alejandro von Eckstein, who was a Paraguayan Nazi. And I got some pretty good stuff. And I got some local character talking about how, you know, these people come here and, yeah, they may have done bad things, but, you know, they're basically decent people trying to live decent lives, you know. I mean, I got all the, I got a guy stopping me from going to a farm, you know, pulling a gun on me and things like that. So I got some pretty good stuff. So I got the ending of the show. And then they put me on camera, you know, in the show. Because to carry some of it, you know, Alan said, we're going to have to shoot you into it, and you do the on-camera stuff. So I did some on camera for it. Well, the show worked. It was, you know, I mean, I even got subpoenaed and had to give a deposition when Mengele was tried in absentia at the German consulate in Los Angeles. Because part of the trial was establishing that Mengele was alive. And they wanted witnesses that had been there and could actually, you know, I couldn't say I saw him, but I gave a lot of information of people who had not only saw him, but associated with him. Mm-hmm. So it worked. It was my kind of breakout show.
That's an incredible story.
Yeah.
So what kind of impact do you think David Wolper made on television with his type of programming? Well,
Wolper, and you know something, I feel bad that Wolper has never, sort of his history went on, Wolper hasn't gotten the credit he deserved in the documentary field especially. Up to Wolper, documentaries on television were made by network news departments. And David Wolper and Jack Haley, because Jack also deserves a lot of credit here. Jack had been in the Signal Corps in the Army, and when he got out, you know, wanted to make films. But he'd wanted to make films when we were going to movies together as kids, you know. And David was a great salesman. I think he'd been an agent with William Morris for a while before this. I'm not absolutely sure. But in any case, he thought he could sell. And so they sold a film called Race for Space that was made independently of the networks, and it was better than anything the networks had done. And David brought kind of and so did Jack, but they both brought kind of a feature sensibility to documentaries, because they did really good sound effects and music, and they made them as feature looking as they could. You know, up to then documentaries were pretty primitive looking, and they kind of put a finish on them. And then even in the writing, you know, David would look for conflict, you know, dramatic conflict within the story. You know, where's the drama? You know, he always demanded that. And he had that going, and Jack was a wonderful editor. I mean, really an extremely talented editor. And Jack could go in a room with piles of footage and 4 days later come out with a really nice film.
So at this point now, you've been working on several TV documentaries. Do you remember the first time you actually saw television?
The first time I actually saw television?
Yeah, in your younger days.
Yeah, sure, I do. I remember it was at Eddie Lazarus's house, and his parents had gotten a television, and this would have been probably the 8th grade, maybe 7th or 8th grade, and I went to Eddie's house, and we sat and we watched wrestling matches, and the wrestler's name was Gorgeous George, and he had like a permed hair.
Yeah.
That was the first TV I ever remember seeing.
Did you watch TV at all internationally when you were traveling?
No, there was no. I don't remember ever seeing television in Germany, or in Spain. I'm not sure Spain even had TV at that time. If it was, it would have been Franco and the Archbishop of Burgos or something talking by the hour, you know. In Europe, I saw a lot. I did see a lot of films, you know, and there wasn't any problem finding art films in Europe, you know. So I did immerse myself in film there.
So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about some of your non-Wilbur television work.
Mm-hmm.
In 1975, you wrote and produced the TV movie Strange New World.
Oh, right.
That was, I think, based on Gene Roddenberry concepts.
It started with a Gene Roddenberry concept. Gene Roddenberry's, the last thing he did for Warner's TV, it had been a pilot. It wasn't called Strange New World, it was called something else. I can't remember the name.
Genesis 2?
And I was just looking for a job, and Ronnie Graham, who's a friend of mine, said, I want to get a first job as a writer, and they said they would hire me if they'll hire you. I said, well, I'm broke right now, so I'll do anything. What is it? And he said, it's a science fiction thing. I said, oh, God, I don't like science fiction, but okay, you know. So it was write and produce this pilot. So we looked at it, and they wanted to do it as a 2-hour movie, but it could be broken into 2 TV shows. So I can't remember exactly how it worked, but it had to do with these people coming back to Earth. They'd been there. It was a dystopian, the story of Earth shattered or something, and they were circling it in some kind of space vehicle, and they came back and they landed here, and then it was the Earth that they found, and they traveled in some vehicle that we designed, and you know, I don't remember it that well.
And it didn't wind up going to series, I don't think.
It didn't go to series, but strangely enough, it ran a lot. I remember it ran for years and years and years. I kept getting residuals for it.
Then in 1985, you started working on Hill Street Blues.
Right.
How did that come about?
Well, I hadn't worked. I did write one documentary. I just wrote the narration for a documentary about the sea.
For Wilbur?
No, it was for ABC, and it was a 3-hour ABC special on the ocean. And this guy Al Giddings produced it, and he asked me to write it. I didn't know this, but he had asked William Holden to narrate it, and Holden didn't like. He said he looked at the script and said, "Why don't you get somebody better to write this?" And so he remembered, Walon Green wrote the Wild Bunch, William Holden, you know. So he said, what if Walon Green would write it? And he said, oh, yeah, get him, you know. So I wrote it, and Bill Holden narrated it. So, but that was just like a quick, you know, it was a job. I mean, I've done a lot of those in my life. And then, I met David Milch, and we became friends, but we weren't working together when he first came out from the East Coast. And I wanted to get, he wasn't interested in the Writers Guild at all, but there was a strike, it was an impending strike. I said, David, you have to go to these strike meetings. I mean, I'm not suggesting we run for offices or anything, but the Guild is important when issues come to whether it's going to be a strike or not. So he said, okay. So we were going to a strike meeting, and he had just been hired. I knew he worked on Hill Street, but I didn't know that he and Jeff were taking over the show.
This is Jeff Lewis?
Yeah. And so we were driving to the meeting, and he said, would you ever consider working on a TV show? You know, I said, yeah. I mean, I like television. I started in television, but I don't know anything about it. And he said, would you want to work? We're going to be doing Hill Street Blues. I loved the show. I knew the show. And he said, would you like to write on it, be a writer on it? And I said, yeah, absolutely. How do you write those shows? I mean, I didn't even know how they wrote them. And he said, I hardly know myself. I mean, I'm new to, David. And he said, but we're running the show. We got to find writers. So that was how I got the job.
So how did you learn to write the show?
Well, I said, let me do a sample script. And he said, it was funny because I don't know whether I gave him the idea or they had it, or it kind of came out of the original Wolper thing of they give you something to do and then they pick the best, I said, why don't you give me a sample script to do, or give them out to people that you want to hire, make them, see which ones work. That way, before you hire them, they've written a show. So they did that. They did it with me, they did it with Dick Wolf, and they did it with a couple of people that didn't get hired. And so I went over to the studio and I had watched the show, but I hadn't watched every single episode. But I went over and I watched all episodes up to then.
And you joined in season 6, right? So
yeah,
5 seasons of
yeah.
shows?
So I just sat in a room watching the show all day. And then, I'd had some feature experience with underworld characters and cops and so forth, so it wasn't a completely, new thing for me. And I had just written a miniseries on Robert Kennedy. I just finished that, I think, the year before, and I'd been working on a film called War Games that I didn't get a credit on, but I did a lot of work on. And when this came along. And so, I wrote the script, and Jeff and David said, absolutely, you should work on the show. So they hired me as a co-EP. And then we read the rest of the scripts, and then we picked Dick for story editor.
What stood out about his script?
His script was good. I mean, Dick, and then I worked with Dick a lot that year because Jeff and David were the showrunners. Jeff and I broke stories a lot. David wrote a lot, and Dick and I wrote individually and then wrote some together. I can't remember how they ran, but I know we worked on shows together. We wrote some individual shows.
Was there an actual writer's room on Hill Street Blues, or?
Sort of. Well, the way we would do it is Jeff and I would try and break the stories ahead, with what was being carried and what new stories were coming in and so forth. And it was a modular show, as they say, like at an A story, a B story, a C story, and a D story. And so we would kind of lay out how we thought the stories went together, just Jeff and myself. And then we would bring everybody in to the room, and then we would sort of put that out, with everybody there. David, being on that one, and then we get everybody's input, and that might go for a couple days, 1 or 2 days, of that. And then some of the shows were written by story, like sometimes they'd say, Walon, why don't you take the Renko story for this show, and then take the other story for another show. We would hand them out like that. Mm-hmm. And we would just write those beats. And then Jeff would collate all the stories. And Jeff and I then maybe, or just Jeff sometimes, but we shifted around. but we would sort of fill in or patch and fill where we needed. Then we'd give them to David, you know. David would sometimes put his spin on it, and you know, sometimes completely take it apart, and sometimes, you know, they went the way they were, and that was how the show was written.
So were David and Jeff kind of on set most of the time, or
No,
split with?
very rarely actually. Now, Bochco had been on set a lot, and the actors were very fond of him, and nobody was happy that he wasn't on the show, and so we did not have a really on that show that kind of rapport I've had on subsequent shows, you know, with the cast. Bochco had left under acrimonious circumstances with MTM, and the actors, his wife was still on the show, you know, Barbara was still on the show, and so there was a little bit of, you know, discordance between us and the set, but it got better, you know. I think they were just really worried. They thought, oh, these new guys could put the show in the toilet, you know. But it worked. The show worked. It was a good season. And
particularly under Bochco, the show was known for some standards and practices battles. Did you guys run into?
yeah, we always had those, but you know, I don't remember any specifically. I just remember pushing, you know, always pushing to go further. And you know, Bochco had probably fought the toughest of those, because those usually occur when a show first comes on, and then they usually just throw up their hands, or you know, just decide they can't fight as hard anymore. Mm-hmm. And so I think Stephen had really it was the plow that broke that plane, you know.
You mentioned it was an MTM show. What
Mm-hmm.
was MTM like just in the mid-'80s?
It was run by these two, well, let's see who was there. Well, St. Elsewhere was there in the same building. And was Cosby there? I can't remember. He might have been in the studio, but I don't know if he wasn't MTM. But they had very little, there were two guys that ran it. I can't even remember their names.
I think Arthur Price was there at that time. Does that sound right?
No. Yes, yeah. I hardly interacted with them at all until the end of the year. Jeff and David wanted me to run the show so they could develop a new series. And MTM said, well, we'll do that, but he has to work without no increase in salary for the coming year. I said, that's not really fair. I should, and so they called my bluff, and I walked, and wrote a couple features.
Just to talk about a few more points with Hill Street, the season you were on, season 6, Dennis Franz came on as
Bunce, right.
So talk a little bit about introducing a new character on an established show like that.
Well, I wasn't there. Bunce actually had appeared on the show, or not Bunce, but Dennis had appeared on the show the year before as a character called Bad Sal Benedetto, a cop, who I think was killed in the episode. I can't remember exactly, but I believe he was killed. And David especially, and Jeff, had fallen in love with this actor, who was a wonderful actor. And so when I came on the show, we really were going to make Bunce like a major player in the show. That was also something that struck a little bit of an awkward chord with the cast, because they felt it was their show and so forth, and suddenly this guy Bunce was getting most of the funny lines, and and he was easy to. I said, Bunce is mischievous but never malicious, and so that was the way we kind of wrote him, that you couldn't tell, on the bottom line he would do the right thing but do it unexpectedly. And I remember when I wrote one of the episodes I wrote a lot of Bunce stuff. David and I probably wrote a good percentage of it, in the episode I wrote, which went back and you saw how Furillo had gotten involved with Davenport. You know, it was a flashback episode. And he was in the hospital. That's how it flashed back. He gets shot and he's in the hospital and so forth. And I had Bunce come and talk to her, talk to Davenport about Furillo and how and try to comfort her. And he did it in a Buncean way, where he said, yeah, this guy, you see him, you think this is a guy, anything could happen to him, he's not going to get up again. But I know different. I think he's actually a pretty tough guy inside. I mean, it was always like, slightly left-handed. And Veronica didn't like that. And she said, why would I talk to him? Why am I not talking to one of the other cast members? Why would I have this? And I said, because it's a skewed conversation. If you do it with the other people, you're going to have to say very traditional things about Furillo. But with Bunce, the conversation can go a completely different direction. And she beefed about it, but in the end, there wasn't much she could do. She did it, and it worked fine.
Were there other characters that you particularly enjoyed writing for?
Yeah, I loved the Bruce White's character. What was his name?
Belker?
Yeah, because Belker, you could do, I remember writing a show where the bits were all silent. He was in a garbage bin for the show. And so it was like a silent movie, He was in the garbage bin and stuff falls, he's hungry and a loaf of bread falls down. It's in a building, it's in a garbage chute. And he looks at the bread, and he picks up the bread and he's looking at it and plop, some mayonnaise lands on the bread like that, And he was great with, with stuff like that. That was the wonderful thing about television overall, is that the cast, and once you know them, you can write to what they really do well. And it becomes a really wonderful, synergetic, experience. And he was great. I liked writing for him. David wrote Furillo. Furillo for me was a little hard to write because he was always so correct, Renko and Hill, they were easy. The other guy, Keel Martin's character, and Torian, I liked writing them a lot. It was a wonderful show to write.
It was known for having kind of a documentary feel. How do you think your background played into your work on the show?
I don't know that my documentary background played much of a role in the show. I think what played more of a role in the show was that I had done a feature called Brink's Job for Bill Friedkin and spent a year in Boston hanging around cops and wise guys. And almost in equal measure. And that gave me a lot of feeling for the show. Mm-hmm. The documentary aspect of the show, I think, was more in the style and the look of the show, which Stephen had created completely. It was there when I got there.
Mm-hmm. What do you think was the most important thing you learned about television writing from your time on Hill Street?
Well, the most important thing I learned about television writing on Hill Street was the pace that you have to write for television, the kind of the intimidation of the pace, but the thrill of seeing the material shot within weeks, or sometimes even less, of having written it. So the feedback, was terrific. And also, as opposed to, say, feature writing, it was so collegial, I mean, you talked about it with other people, you argued about it, you topped each other, it was somewhat competitive, but not in a bad way. It was nicely competitive. I loved it. I mean, as soon as I did it, I was mad that they didn't make the deal, and it wasn't really, and I didn't do the show again. And it was strictly a financial thing, because I don't know, you know, your agents tell you not to do it unless and whatnot, and then you think, well, I want to do it anyway, but then you end up following what they say. That happens on stuff. But I thought, I want to get back and write on a TV show again as soon as I can. I thought I'd rather write this any day than write features.
Why is that?
Because for the very reasons I just told you, that it was immediate, it was fast, you knew the cast. The writing was, you know, I thought the writing was good. It was really good. It wasn't dictated by front office concerns and 5 people who don't write. Everybody that told you what to do on a show like Hill Street was a writer. And so you weren't talking with people that didn't write. And so you could discuss things as a writer with other writers. And once in a while it might happen on a feature. And I've been on features where I had really good relationships with directors, excellent even. But that experience in television was, especially David and Jeff, I mean, you know, you couldn't do better, you know.
What do you think is the legacy of Hill Street Blues?
Well, I think Hill Street Blues, I think it has a legacy for people even that you don't even know Hill Street Blues. You know, it created a different kind of cop genre shows, certainly. And, but you could say that, you could almost make that a blanket statement about Bochco's stuff in general. You know, Bochco brought a transition to television. You know, the others were kind of more, and I'm not deriding them because they were really good shows, you know, like Columbo and so forth are those shows. They're really good shows, but they are a traditional TV drama, you know, and Hill Street broke that mold. I remember when I saw the pilot and they shot the leads. And I wasn't working on the show or anything. I was sitting in my house, oh my God, they just shot the leads, you know. I mean, and combining that with the sexuality of the workplace and all of the subtext of things that were going on, you know, made it very special. A friend of mine, David Mills, who is a wonderful writer, he's deceased, he was going to write a book, and the theme of his book was about television, was that Hill Street Blues was really the major change from old television to new television. And I knew what he meant.
All right, let's take a short break.
Okay.